Alright. Look, man. I get it. You're just wanting to play some Vanguard with your friends, have some fun. Not a big deal. But also, that single start deck you picked up a couple months back isn't going to cut it forever either. You don't want to sit there and get trounced game after game after game. But how much would you expect to spend to be able to hold your own in a game with your friends? $50? $100? $200? $1,000? Not even close. Don't even worry, because I got you. All you need is that start deck and $20, and you too could have a solid, playable deck to be able to play with your friends at locals. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Who Says You Can't Have Fun on a Budget? So the other day I was streaming and talking with chat, and you know what, speaking of, then I'm gonna say it, just there it is, you already know what to do. Anyways, we got on the topic of budget decks and what you can do with only $20 in the current standard format. And this was a challenge that I had a lot of fun with, and I might have went a little crazy and tried to build as many decks as I could with that strict $20 price point plus a start deck. Hopefully you already have a start deck and you didn't pay too much for it. I know things were kind of getting price gouged there for a bit, but now you should be able to get them for about, $6 with shipping. Not that big of a deal anymore. And you'll actually kind of need them because all of these builds use the triggers and PGs from those decks. But the idea of building a deck on a $20 budget was really fun for me, and I feel like the budget side of things has been kind of neglected in Vanguard, especially throughout V, where at first you certainly had like some decks that were budget and were definitely playable and could even be better than the higher rarity versions, but as that series went on, it definitely got to a point where if you were playing budget, you almost might as well not even bother playing against certain decks because you just couldn't stand a chance. Sure, they tried giving us things like Ancient Dragons and Seven Seas, but when those were up against the likes of Luard, things like that, there really was no point, was there? But now, going into set 2 of overdress, I feel like they've done a really good job of creating cards that players on a budget can make use of and have a solid playable deck with a definitive game plan that can actually win. There's plenty of cards in both of these sets that's like, oh man, the card's good, but there's just no room to play it with other things. Well, here's where these budget decks come in, and building these was a ton of fun, and honestly, some of them are only just slightly watered down from their top tier counterparts. So that also provides you with a way to have a solid playable deck for $20 right now that you could also then gradually upgrade if you wanted to. And since set 3 got pushed back to December for English, you'll have plenty of time to do so as well. But if you want to, you also don't have to. It just feels really great right now that for players who either have to or just want to play on a budget, can and not be too punished for it. Now, before we start taking a look at the deck list, just a quick disclaimer, all of these decks cost about $20 plus a start deck at the time of recording. Now, obviously prices fluctuate, so this could change, but it shouldn't change so much that you're going to be paying that much more or that much less than $20. And hey, if it is cheaper than $20, then that makes more room for other upgrades that you could fit into the deck if you need to. Hopefully though, all these prices stay pretty close to that $20 mark. Also, please do not leave comments asking, why did you run this and not this? These are budget decks, and the answer is probably, I'm running these certain cards because the other alternative versions cost too much to fit within that $20 price point. That being said, if you do not have to stick to such a strict $20 budget, you don't have to. The upgrade paths for these decks are very, very clear, and you can pick up the pieces that you want or have the means for at your discretion. Now, that being said, let's take a look at the lists. We're going to start off with Dragon Empire and take a look at Nirvana. I have 2 different lists for Nirvana because this deck is honestly pretty tricky to build at that $20 budget, just because all of the overdress pieces are either high rarity or in high demand, thus having a very high price. Hopefully the reprint of set 1 next month will kind of help some of these prices and make it easier for you to get them. But because of that, we're only running a single playset of the original Virena because that's all we have. That also means we're playing 3 copies of Sunburst Evolution to recycle that Virena because, again, it's all we have. We also have 3 copies of Horn of Blessing, which is our budget alternative to Arcs, which also makes it more usable to be able to use the Sunburst evolution to get back the Virina that we discard for that order cost. Now, unfortunately, a single Urger would completely use up our entire $20 budget. So instead of multi-attacking with Urger, we are going all in on Damari to multi-attack with Trickstars instead. That also means we're running a full playset of Aruna to at least be able to hit an 18k number, 28k if we Persona Road, so that our Trickstar can actually hit numbers. Other than that, we also have Blaze Maiden Tanya to be able to continue recalling our Trickstars from drop and also giving it a buff as well to, again, continue to hit numbers. All in all, I think this is probably the best way to kind of replicate the overdress deck play experience on a $20 budget. But as you go and you find yourself to be able to pick up or receive the extra overdress pieces, you should be able to very easily update this over time into its full powered form. Now, a list that is also budget, but I think is better than the overdress list, is just going all in on a lot of the Blaze Maiden support that we got in set 2. This almost entirely forgoes the overdress mechanic altogether because we are cutting down to only 2 Virina, because really this whole deck just focuses on using our Blaze Maidens to fill the board at turn 1 and rush the opponent down with numbers. We also have plenty of ways to recycle our Trickstars in this deck, and also plenty of ways to give power to our Trickstars in this deck so that Trickstar is also a number pusher. We're also making use of the new Blaze Maiden Zara, who is in 11k as long as we have Reno or Ryu on our Vanguard or Rearguard, and since those are some pretty good beaters as well, we're going to be able to push from the early game right from the get-go. Tanya is also played at a full 4 copies in this deck just because we can discard triggers for our ride deck and be able to call them back with her and then power them up to essentially plus our board and just keep pushing every single turn. This deck lacks in multi-attacking, but I feel like it makes up for it in the fact that you're going to be pushing for 18, 20, 23k columns right from turn 1 on every single lane. Really, this is just a Blaze Maiden and Trickstar aggro deck, and both of these decks are using Trickstar as the starter just because you want to have them in your drop as soon as possible. Lastly, for Dragon Empire, we also have Eugene, which there's really not much to say about this deck because this is just Eugene. There's really not that much sacrificed other than using the start deck PGs and the start deck overtrigger. Other than that, this is just the exact same build that you would run at full power. So honestly, for an extra 20-30 bucks, you can have just fully built Eugene. Eugene best deck, I guess. Taking a look at Bruce now, Bruce is actually in a pretty good spot for that $20 price point, I feel like, mainly because other than Leonard, the 2 main cards that really make an impact in this deck are a rare and a common. So you really aren't suffering too much when playing this deck. Obviously, we can't afford Marjorie's at this $20 price point, so we're going all in on the Fist Colossus, and thankfully we're able to afford a full play set of Protobulb Dragon, which has a nice interaction with Fist Colossus as well because we're able to put him into the soul and bounce him back to hand so that we can continue reusing him turn after turn to take full advantage of that 15k power buff he gains. We also have Geardober, which is fantastic to also help us continue to push numbers and plus our soul, and the full playset of the Hellblast Full Dive to, again, just make huge numbers. We also have 2 copies of the Special Violence Yell to add some extra defense to our deck as well, but you could totally swap this out for just about anything else that you would like instead. This deck is another one that is really easy to upgrade because you can just drop your extra Richards and the 2 Violence Yell, throw in some Leonards, swap out the Fist Colossus for Marjorie, and then get yourself the Recusal Hate Dragon PGs, and then boom, you have like a top tier deck in overdress. But I don't think you're suffering too bad if this is the way you have to play it either. Now we're going to take a look at Bastion, and Bastion is really tricky to build at a $20 price point, mainly because your 2 main most important cards in a fully built Bastion deck are Fasado and Alden, which each cost about the entire budget of $20 on their own. So to try and make up for that, we are running the Prideful Dragon and Aphion instead. This also gives our deck a bit of a Persona Ride focus as well, and since each of these can draw us cards, we're not suffering too bad when it comes to not having Alden, especially since we also have the Alden order, I like to call it, because that's essentially all it is an order that gives something 5k and lets you draw 2 cards. So you have that option as well. And we're also running a playset of the Painkiller Angel instead of the Darkstrain Dragon. You could do either or. I just went with the Painkiller Angel just because that way we have another way in the deck to hit numbers and also draw ourselves cards. So that way we ideally aren't suffering too badly by not having Alden in the deck. Other than that, this deck is also really easy to upgrade. You could potentially even make room for the Form Up Chosen Knights to add more card draw, but since we're already running a full playset of the Draw 2 order, I didn't want the orders to get too cloggy, but you could totally swap those around if you needed. You could also probably try and make room for Noble Will. It's very similar to the Special Violence Yell, and that it gives 20k defense on your Vanguard. Might be something to look into over the Coca BL instead. But other than that, this deck also has a very clear and easy upgrade path. Just pick up 4 Fasado, pick up 4 Alden, pick up your set 1 PGs and your Keter Sanctuary Overtrigger, and you're good. Now we're going to take a look at Magnolia, and Magnolia is another one of those decks that is only slightly watered down from its fully built version, and I think this one actually is pretty good. Obviously we can't afford the new triple rare from set 2, so instead in its place we are running a full playset of Duger. Well, it doesn't do quite the same thing as that. It at least gets the 5k, so you have an extra 15k beater. Thankfully we're able to afford the full playset of Urgula, which combos really well with Cookie, whatever, 15k puppy guy, to be able to fill our board with a bunch of 15k bodies to multi-attack our opponent into oblivion. And we also have our budget Wild Intelligence in Bilbar. Doesn't quite do the same thing as Wild Intelligence, but it's close enough for these purposes. Next, we have Seraph Snow, who again, I think benefits from the fact that 2 of the most heavily played cards from the new set are just a common and a rare. We have the full play set of Bug Motor to be able to consistently fill up our prison, and we have the 24-hour coverage order to be able to rip cards out of our opponent's hand and also continue to fill up our prison. While we can't afford the 2 triple rare grade 2s for the deck, we have some decent-ish replacements in Mel Horizon to be able to continue to fill up our prison should we need to. And we're also thankfully able to afford 2 copies of Derry Violet, who is effectively a PG for grade 2s. And while we can't afford that Agra Rouge, we still have at least the playset of Grapple External to fill half of the role in being at least a 15k beater. He doesn't gain the shield, but hey, I mean, sun is better than nothing, right? We also are able to make room for 2 copies of the, is this Melting Heart? I forget what this card's name is, but essentially it can just really minus our opponent's power way, way down depending on how full our prison is. Next, we're going to talk about Baromagnes, which of course, I'm going to include a barrel list considering it's my favorite deck. And this deck is kind of what actually inspired this whole concept of building $20 decks, because this was a list that I built for my Baromagnes video, but I ended up cutting just because I didn't feel like it warranted too much discussion, but it definitely does here. We're running only a single copy of Baromagnes just because 1, that's all we can afford, and 2, it's all we really need. He gets the extra 10k every single turn anyways, so that works out just fine. Unfortunately, we can only afford a single copy of Electro Spartan, but that's okay because we have the 3 copies of Supernatural Extraction, and we can totally bounce that back to our hand and call it down with that. And then from there, it's just running a bunch of copies of cards that either soul charge or give power. We have the full playset of Time Jarrett Dragon to be able to plus our soul and keep digging through our deck for more pieces to be able to bash our opponent with. 4 copies of Spherical Splasher, which is just essentially extra copies of Deep Sonicer, except it focuses more on just having Barrow on your Vanguard rather than having 10 cards in Soul. 4 copies of Selfish Engraver because the card is way too good. 2 copies of Cyclone Circler, which again, gives power and pluses our soul, and 4 copies of Deformed Hammer, which is just a 10k beater. From there, we only have the 3 copies of Brother's Soul, just because one start deck only comes with 3 Brother's Soul. But if you're able to get a 4th copy, you can totally drop a copy of Supernatural Extraction to make room for the 4th copy of Brother's Soul as well. You could also swap the Cyclone Circler for Freeze Breeze and the Supernatural Extractions for Crawl You Insects to kind of replicate the tempo style build from my Baromagnes video if you want to try that as well. And all in all, for $20, I think this is a pretty solid way to be able to play Baromagnes on that very tight budget. And lastly, a list that I had a ton of fun building is the budget Zorga list. Obviously, building Zorga for $20 is going to be very, very difficult, but set 2 gave us this awesome card in Iron Anchor Resentment Dragon, and I love that they did this, and I really hope that this is something that they continue to do going forward with set 3 and onward, because things like this make for a perfect budget boss and make for a really fun, creative way to deck build. Because while it's similar to Zorga in that it can alchemagic, Zorga wants you to use 2 different orders, while this guy specifically has you use 2 of the same order. So because of that, instead of running a diverse list of several different orders, we're really just going all in on 3 different ones that we don't mind doubling up on. Basically, our game plan is to set up using Cursed Soul, Screaming in Agony, which will fill up our drop zone and then plus our board, but we will only do that play if we have a Hendrina on board, because she reduces our Soul Blast costs. Without Hendrina, we wouldn't be able to do that play because we just wouldn't have enough soul. And then that allows us to go into our next turn to be able to use Nectar of Sensationalism to be able to add a ton of power on 2 of our units, and ideally also give them a crit. Hopefully one of those units will also be Fleet Swallower, which has the Battle Door effect. Hopefully it can also be Sleeve Tugging Bell or something, I forget what her English name was, who gets a ton of power when we call her because she puts all of our bound cards back into our drop zone, which can also help us alchemagic more. Other than that, we have the Regurgitation from the Underworld, which is our backup plan to the Cursed Souls order. You could also run Spiritual Body Condensation instead, but that card was a little pricey to fit in this $20 budget. Regurgitation is also great though, because it can help control our opponent's board while also flooding our own. Really, really good. This is honestly a list that I think I'm going to build just because it looks so just fun. Like I'm actually like legitimately interested in playing this Iron Anchor Resentment Dragon because it's so cool to me, and this is something that I just really want to see Bushiroad continue to do going forward. Well, those are my lists for a very strict $20 budget. I actually had a ton of fun going through and building all of these decks and finding different ways to build decks with this very tight restriction. Hopefully these lists prove useful to you or someone you know who just needs or wants to play on a budget, or maybe you just want an extra deck to play that you don't want to have to spend too much on. Either way, I hope they're as fun for you as they were for me making them. That'll be it for me though. Make sure to like and share and subscribe and all the YouTube things. It really goes a long way in helping me out, and I appreciate you a lot for it. But yeah, till next time.